Mobster pushed Bumpy's pregnant wife downstairs. 48 hours later, his entire family begged the staircase went silent. A body fell. Laughter echoed once, then stopped. In Harlem, some insults demanded fists. Others demanded patience. And Bumpy Johnson was already counting the hours. The building wasn't loud. That's what made it worse. A narrow stairwell. Dim light. The kind of place where voices usually stayed low out of habit, not fear. Shoes scraped concrete. Someone laughed, too comfortably. Bumpy Johnson wasn't there. That mattered. His wife moved carefully, one hand resting against her side, her steps measured. Harlem knew her walk, knew her restraint, knew what she carried, not just the child, but the weight of who stood behind her. The mobster didn't. He stood above her, blocking the way down, posture loose, smile careless. Power, he thought, lived in height, in space, in the fact that no one had stopped him yet. Words came first. They always do. Disrespect dressed up as humor. A comment meant for an audience. The kind of insult that tests silence, waiting to see if it will answer back. She said nothing. That pause should have warned him. Instead, he leaned in, too close. One hand brushed the rail. Another gesture, small, unnecessary, deliberate. Then the shove. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just enough. The sound wasn't loud when she fell. A body hitting steps never is. The stairwell froze. Breath caught. Someone turned away. Someone else stared too long. No one rushed forward right away. Not because they didn't care, but because they understood something had just changed. The mobster laughed once. Then he noticed the silence. No shouting. No chows. Just stillness. The kind that settles when a rule has been broken so cleanly there's no confusion about it. Men helped her up carefully. Someone called for a doctor. Someone else left without being asked. The mobster kept talking, trying to fill the air he'd poisoned. Explaining. Minimizing. Smiling like it was already over. It wasn't. Harlem doesn't react fast. It reacts correctly. By the time the stairwell emptied, the story had already started moving. Quietly, efficiently, without embellishment. No exaggeration needed. A pregnant woman. A staircase. A man who forgot where he was standing. And somewhere else in the city, Bumpy Johnson was about to hear it. Not from a messenger, not from Scream, but the way he always heard things first. Through silence. By mid-morning, the streets had already whispered the story. Not in shouts, not in headlines, but in the quiet exchanges that carried more weight than a gunshot ever could. A shopkeeper behind a polished counter nodded to a passing neighbor. Doormen on stoops straightened slightly. Everyone who mattered knew. Someone had overstepped, and the city was listening. Bumpy Johnson hadn't said a word. That was the point. His absence carried authority. His restraint was louder than any confrontation. The city remembered what he had built. Not through chaos, but through inevitability. Respect had been earned in quiet rooms and closed doors, in moments where restraint had proven stronger than rage. Now, it rippled outward like a current beneath the streets. The women in the market lowered their voices as they passed one another. Children were called inside earlier than usual. Men who usually strode with confidence paused mid-step, reconsidering whom they bumped against, whom they watched, and where they leaned their weight. There was no panic. There was recognition. This was a different kind of power, the sort that demanded attention without needing a fist raised. Rumors, carefully phrased, began circulating. A pregnant woman shoved down a staircase. A mobster's arrogance exposed in the daylight. Nothing flashy, nothing exaggerated, just truth carried on the lips of those who had learned long ago that exaggeration diminishes authority. Every word measured, every reaction deliberate. Bumpy's allies moved subtly. No announcements, no signals. They watched the streets, guided traffic with invisible hands. It wasn't protection that made their presence felt. It was principle. Anyone with eyes could see it. The city had rules, and someone had broken them. The rules didn't belong to one man alone. They belonged to the man who kept order, who inspired loyalty, and who punished transgressions with precision, not impulse. And the mobster? He began to feel the current even before Bumpy appeared. Doors closed when he approached. Conversations died when he lingered too long. Offers were refused, glances averted. The city itself seemed to contract around him, reminding him that his height, his bravado, his wealth, all of it meant nothing without respect. In Harlem, respect was earned, demanded, and enforced. And he had just forgotten the first rule: never disrespect Bumpy Johnson's family. By the end of the day, the message had traveled from stoops to back alleys to small cafes where men sipped coffee slowly, eyes flicking toward the street, remembering the stairwell, the silence, the potential for consequence. And somewhere, far from the streets, Bumpy's gaze was already considering the hours to come, not in anger, but in calculation, knowing that the city would bend without needing a single raised hand. Silence had become the loudest weapon of all. The clock started ticking the moment Bumpy Johnson learned what had happened. 48 hours. That was all it would take for the city to adjust, for the rules to reassert themselves, for those who had miscalculated to realize how thin the line truly was. The mobster moved through the streets like a man walking underwater. Friends didn't answer his calls. Doors that had once opened with ease stayed shut. Allies who once smiled in greeting now avoided his eyes. Each step became measured, each breath a calculation. The city, silent but observant, had already begun reshaping itself around the absence of proper respect. Harlem did not act hastily. It never did. It calculated, observed, waited for the inevitable. Every barber, shopkeeper, and taxi driver knew the story. Every glance, every muttered comment reinforced it. The insult wasn't just remembered. It was quantified, evaluated, and stored in the collective understanding of who wielded authority and who had overstepped. Inside a dimly lit apartment, men whispered, mapping routes, predicting movements, imagining outcomes. The mobster's family felt it too. Fear, restrained but growing, etched itself into their routines. Every knock on the door, every ring of the telephone became a test of endurance. And in every corner of Harlem, there was a subtle acknowledgement. Bumpy Johnson's patience was not weakness. It was strategy, and strategy, when executed quietly, was lethal. The mobster tried to regain normalcy. He laughed at jokes that weren't funny. He gestured in conversations that ended abruptly. Yet the city seemed to shrink around him, traffic parting without thought, neighbors' eyes following him with subtle disdain, doors shutting before he could enter. Even the children on stoops noticed the difference. Whispering the name, they had learned to respect in hushed tones. Meanwhile, Bumpy's allies maintained a careful presence. Not protection, not threat, just attention. They were the silent current beneath the streets. Their glances, gestures, and positions broadcasted the unspoken truth. Any misstep would carry consequences far greater than the initial insult. And the mobster, for all his bravado, could feel it pressing against him, narrowing his options, constricting his confidence. By the end of the second day, the tension had become palpable. The city itself seemed to hold its breath. The insult had transformed into power dynamics, community loyalty, and moral reckoning. And through it all, Bumpy Johnson watched, calculated, waited, let the hours pass. Silence was not absence. Silence was authority. And the mobster's realization of that truth would come too late. The city had a memory. Harlem never forgot who commanded the streets, who demanded loyalty without raising a voice. And now, that memory had been tested. The mobster stepped out of his building, expecting familiarity. He expected nods, the polite distance of those who feared him but tolerated his presence. Instead, he found hesitation. Eyes followed him, widened slightly, then looked away. Conversations ceased mid-sentence. Shopkeepers lingered at their counters longer than necessary, giving him no acknowledgement. The respect he had taken for granted was gone. His own allies began to falter. Men who had once laughed in his company now glanced at their feet, shifted weight, avoided eye contact. Small gestures, hand brushing against a lapel, a step backward, betrayed the unease that was spreading faster than any street gossip. He was still powerful, still wealthy, still armed, but none of it mattered when the city itself withdrew its consent. Word of the stairwell incident traveled, carefully phrased, muted, whispered only where it mattered. By noon, even distant neighborhoods had caught the story. The insult was public. Its consequences, however, were private. And in those private spaces, the mobster began to notice cracks in his carefully maintained image. The fear he cultivated had shifted. Fear without respect is hollow. It is unstable. At a Harlem cafe, a group of men sipped coffee silently, observing the streets. They didn't speak directly to him, but the message was clear. One wrong move, one attempt at intimidation, and the community would respond, not with noise, not with chaos, but with isolation, subtle but absolute. The mobster's family noticed it first. Small things. Hesitation at the table, voices softer, glances over shoulders. They had learned that when Bumpy Johnson's patience was tested, the response was inevitable and precise. Panic, restrained and calculated, began to seep into the spaces they had always assumed were safe. Even in private meetings, he found himself explaining, negotiating, flattering. The confidence he carried into daylight hours was already diminished. And though no hand had struck him and no bullet had fired, the power had shifted. The city itself had whispered its verdict. The man who had violated Bumpy's household had overstepped. And Harlem, in its quiet, inexorable way, waited for the reckoning. The line had been drawn. Respect, not fear, had determined the new order. And Bumpy Johnson's authority was the axis on which that order now turned. Silence carried the weight of inevitability. Bumpy Johnson arrived without announcement. No entourage, no flerish, just the measured click of his shoes on the worn Harlem pavement, echoing softly through the alleyway where the mobster waited, unaware that the lesson had already begun. The mobster's bravado faltered as he saw him. Nothing in Bumpy's stance, nothing in the tilt of his fedora betrayed urgency or anger. He was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that unsettled more than shouting ever could. Eyes fixed, shoulders squared, hands relaxed, but the weight of intention radiated like heat. They met in a narrow space between two brick buildings. The air was thick with anticipation, and for a moment, the city itself seemed to pause. No one else was needed. No weapons drawn. No shootout. Just presence. Authority distilled into a single figure. The mobster spoke first, tried to reclaim control. Words stumbled out, clipped, measured but weak. Bumpy listened. One slow nod, a subtle shift of weight. That was all. Silence answered him more effectively than any strike could have. Each pause, each careful glance, pressed the truth into the mobster's chest. The insult, the shove, the arrogance. It was no longer a question of retaliation. It was a question of principle. Then a few words. Calm, clear, no raised voice, no demands. Just a fact. A family is untouchable. Respect is owed. Crossing that line has consequences beyond fear, beyond anger. Consequences that ripple outward, changing the way the world moves. The mobster understood instantly. Not through threat, not through force, through the quiet authority of a man who needed no display, who had already won by standing firm, by letting time and morality carry the weight of the lesson. Bumpy's allies, positioned invisibly nearby, did not intervene. Their presence alone reinforced the message. Power does not require noise, and loyalty is not forced. It is recognized. In those moments, the city watched, and the lesson spread further than any bullet could reach. The line had been drawn, and it was unmistakable. Harlem knew that silence had delivered judgment, and that judgment had been administered by a man whose restraint was more formidable than any act of violence. The mobster's arrogance had crumbled without a single strike. Control, calm, and authority had prevailed. Silence, observation, dominance. By the morning after, the city had already shifted. The mobster's family arrived, quietly, nervously, their footsteps echoing down streets that once obeyed their presence. They came not with threats, not with negotiations, but with pleas, words that stumbled and faltered before the weight of inevitability. Bumpy Johnson stood where he had always stood, calm, composed, unwavering. The streets gave him space. The people around him maintained distance, eyes alert, shoulders squared. His presence alone carried authority. No fichte, no veapon, no shot. Just the quiet, absolute certainty that the lesson had been delivered. The family spoke quickly, desperately, flinching at the pauses he allowed. Each word exposed the cracks that arrogance had carved into their lives. Bumpy listened. One slow, deliberate nod here. A tilt of the head there. He allowed them to feel the gravity of the mistake themselves. Fear is more lasting when it is realized, not imposed. Harlem had already judged. Shopkeepers, street vendors, and men on stoops observed from safe distances, nodding subtly to one another. The city's memory reinforced the principle. Violations against the household, against community respect, do not go unanswered. Not through chaos, but through control, through patience, through legacy. The mobster's family left with nothing but the knowledge of their own miscalculation. They had begged. They had offered excuses. They had imagined leverage. But in that calm exchange, they had learned a lesson that could not be erased. Power was not taken with fists or fear. It was recognized in the restraint of the man who had already won. Bumpy Johnson remained. The streets resumed their rhythm, the day unfolding with a quiet intensity. But beneath every step, every glance, the message lingered. Respect was earned, authority was observed, and loyalty was constant. The city had witnessed a reckoning without violence, and that reckoning would echo long after the sound of footsteps faded. Harlem understood. The mobster understood. And in that understanding, Bumpy Johnson's legacy deepened, built not on rage, not on spectacle, but on a principle so strong it left even the proudest adversaries kneeling in recognition. Silence, not threat. Patience, not impulse. Restraint, not vengeance. That was power, and that power would endure.